So welcome to session 12. How's the conference going for everybody so far? A good time? Yeah, soaking it all in. Everybody looking forward to the social afterwards? Good. Yeah, Chris is, yeah. So I get by with a little herp from my friends. I think Tom came up with that title, and it's my favorite title of the whole program. I get by with a little herp from my friends. Our first speaker is Tom Langen. He's going to talk about Blanding's turtles, identifying road encounter hotspots of Blanding's turtles using sparse, unsystematically collected data and behavioral modeling. It's all yours, Tom.
To advance your slide, just not that way.
Many apologies. Okay, so identifying road encounter hotspots. And I say road encounter because that can be roadkill, but it can be places where animals encounter the roads going somewhere and are deterred using sparse, unsystematically collected data. And what I mean by that is the kind of opportunistic data that people collect when they record and they're driving and they encounter an animal. Often is particularly scarce or rare animals, like many of our herps, where we have databases like iNaturalist or Heritage Program or other things where people are reporting things, but the data is really very sparse or not very dense on a geographic data and full of biases is how it's collected. Okay. Okay. Yeah, good. All right. So, we have a number of tools that we can use for modeling. This is not going to get into the details of modeling, but kind of thinking about the big picture concepts. We can look at spatial and clusters of encounter records. And so we can use that to look at some kind of clustering. And generally, we can only do that in a way, for example, here's for turtles, where we have very systematically collected on roads, where we have similar search effort and similar detectability across that. So when we have, this is a direct measure of road encounters, usually requires a lot of data to do well. It's subject to all kinds of biases in survey effort and detectability, unless it's done by a systematic survey. So most of the time, we don't have that kind of data. We have data where on some roads, happens to be driven by a biology professor that records lots and lots of data of what they encounter. Lots of other roads where we get no records, in part because people can't identify the animal or don't know how to report it or not interested in reporting it. It's not suitable for animals and void road encounters, and it's not suitable for detecting depleted population. Now, we can look at associated road features or habitat and road features to try to predict where road encounters occur if we know what those might be. So we might have data that allows us to predict, for example, that places with high traffic volumes and wetlands in proximity might be indicators of places where turtles might cross roads, particularly if we have a lot of data. We can use a model that we developed to apply to all roads, not just surveyed roads. But to do it, we either need expert knowledge or else we've got to do some kind of habitat association modeling. And that habitat association modeling typically compares encounter locations with things that are called pseudo-absence or random points. What is the difference between the places where the animals encounter roads and the general road network environment that will help us to predict that? Now, the challenge is getting an unbiased set of encounter and pseudo-absences or those comparison points. That's where the problem lies usually in trying to model with this approach. Finally, we can try to predict where animals encounter roads by their behavior, how they move through the landscape, right? So for example, if we know where they go from one point to another, we can predict how they move through. The simplest assumption is but there's some straight line distance that they might move. And you could predict where the roads lie with that straight line distance, where there might be clusters of encounters or encounters are most frequent. That's what Baudry et al. Did in 2008 for Landing's turtles and spotted turtles. You can also, slightly more sophisticated, if you know what kinds of habitat or land cover topography an animal prefers to move through or prefers to avoid, you can predict their movement patterns, perhaps a little more accurately using least cost path or path of least resistance modeling. So it's a behavioral model that, again, you can use to infer where it's likely that animals encounter roads, if your assumptions about how animals move through the landscape are correct. You can apply that to all roads. So you can do it in a whole road network rather than a small number of roads, but you've got to have an accurate map of habitat at the relevant scale, which is not always the case for small reptiles and amphibians. You need expert knowledge in movement preference or movement preference modeling, maybe data from radio tracking or something else that helps you understand how they move through the landscape. You need to validate it some way. And so that brings me to Blanding's turtle. So Blanding's turtles are a species of turtle in northeastern North America that are threatened or endangered throughout their range from Nebraska to New Brunswick, basically in the glaciated Northeast. They move through isolated wetlands. They visit vernal pools and other small wetlands. They can sometimes classified as semi-terrestrial. They go long distances over land. They're at low density in most places, and they're rarely encountered on roads. At least my experience is you rarely encounter them. Common surrogates to sort of figure out where maybe hotspots of crossing, like using painted turtles or snapping turtles, may not be appropriate because these animals are less aquatic. They tend to move more over land, perhaps, than these other turtles. They don't avoid roads, so far as we know. Behaviorally, they will go right into a road when they encounter them. And females are vulnerable during nesting migrations, and we know that. We know from a lot of data that that's the case. And people who have looked closely at sources of mortality in this species consider roadkill as a major cause of decline in some areas of the Northeast. So I work in the St. Lawrence Valley of New York State, right on the Canadian border. And it's an area where there is perhaps the strongest population of Blanding's turtle in New York State, and one of the centers for the population between here and Ontario, across the river in the Northeast. And so we're interested in understanding where specifically these animals occur, what kind of habitat needs to be protected. When we did species distribution modeling, one of the things that we found is that they are much less likely to occur in wetlands where they are within 100 meters of a road. So at local scales, roads, there's a negative association that's probably associated with roadkill and roadkill depletion. And we can use that to sort of, we've kind of predicted or know where the animals are. We've looked more carefully, and for non-road related reasons, we've looked at genetic differentiation among different populations, and we modeled movement corridor or areas in terms of landscape connectivity within the region in where we work and where we have these Blanding's turtle populations. One of the things we noticed very clearly when we did that first range is that many of the records that we have as road records of turtles, either roadkill or crossing the roads, coincided with the predicted sort of high connectivity areas or high connectivity corridors. So that got us thinking we should look more closely at whether this is going to be effective for predicting those kinds of road encounter hotspots for this species. So we have an area where we have 240 wetlands that we've surveyed. About 87 of them we found Blanding's turtles. Doing road surveys, doing very structured road surveys, we only found 2 Blanding's turtles out of 6,500 kilometers of driving. That's what I mean by sparse. Systematic driving is not the way to find these animals. But we do have about 235 records of just opportunistic records that people have called in, recorded, that we've seen, that we can verify are likely to be real records. Of these, about 62% are females, 11% are adult males, and the rest are unsexed. So you can see there's a really strong sex bias. And most of the records are in June when they nest, and 43% of the females are gravid. So what we're really seeing is, particularly with Blanding's turtles, road encounters is females that are going and nesting or coming back from nesting. So here's a bunch of points of road encounters of Blanding's turtles. You can see some gaps, you see some clusters, but we've got two problems with these data, right? First is that road occurrence records and gaps are a factor of both the survey effort and real presence and absences. So where you see gaps there, maybe those are absences, maybe it's areas that don't get a lot of driving attention by biologists who record those turtle presence or others. The second is, what you really want to look at in terms of thinking about mitigation or survey effort is areas where roads bisect areas where the animals actually occur, and not overall. We can do things where we look at presence and absence, but most of those areas are absent that look as absence are absent because there are no turtles there. We want to know from a road perspective where they're at. So what we have done, first of all, is looked at the road records that we have, and to consider a valid way of comparing. What we do is take a road record and we look at the road conditions and habitat associations, or land cover and land use, at 1 kilometer away from them. So basically on the same road. So we do paired comparisons on the same road at what we think is a reasonable scale for the movements of these animals. Points and then areas that are separate. And then we look at things like habitat associations there, road associations between those pseudo-absence points and the actual presence points, distances from wetlands between those points, and so forth. And so with that matched presence and absence road data, we look at 5 land cover classes, 3 wetland distances, 3 spatial scales, and the best presence is at the 100-meter scale, local, low coverage of grasslands and developed land, so particularly hayfields and things like that, high coverage of woody wetlands, and proximity to water on both sides of the roads. Actually, it's pretty similar to the potential surrogate turtles that we kind of threw out before. Multivariate modeling classified things very well in terms of presence versus absence. And some of the model validations we've done show that they probably were. Now, we also then clipped the road network to roads with either Blanding's turtle road encounters or wetlands within 100 meters of the road that we knew had Blanding's turtles. So fairly localized, but the whole entire road network that fit those areas that turtles were probably present, and did a kernel density estimation. For cold spots, we picked random locations greater than 250 meters from the hotspots, but within that zone that we're talking about. And located 24 hotspots, about 5.8 kilometers of road out of about 1,000 kilometers of road that were really popped. 41% of the encounters were here, which means, there's still 60% of them are outside of it, but there's quite a few that are localized in a few places. Again, the best predictors were low coverage of grassland or developed land and high coverage of woody wetlands. We then did a least cost paths analysis within the range that we knew we had wetlands where Blanding's turtles were present. We used resistance values that were based on our previous work, where we actually had data on where kinds of habitat that Blanding's more frequently or less frequently were willing to move through. Least cost paths comprise about 25% of the road network that we analyzed. About 42% of the road encounters occurred there. Hotspots were significantly closer than our cold spots or random points. 8 of 24 hotspots were within least cost paths, and the medium distance overall was about 140 meters from it. So at the spatial scale that even if it's not right on, if you went to those places and looked around, you might be able to locate those spots. So on the one hand, it's not great. On the other hand, it's better than what we had before. And so what we conclude is that, first of all, that these are principally nesting migrations. And to improve our modeling, we've got to know more about movement patterns, identifying nesting sites, along with the wetlands that we use. We can use these sort of opportunistic or happenstance road encounter data to predict hotspots despite all the biases. And I think that the reality, the big take-home message is for a lot of the data sets that we have for other threatened and declining turtle species in the Northeast, or in general for smaller species of animals where there's lots of biases in the data collection, we can still do something with that will help us to predict where mitigation might, or at least survey effort could focus, and maybe mitigation. So they're predictable at scales relevant to mitigation, and positively predictive at road habitat features we can measure. And least cost paths are probably predictive of road encounter locations and can let us narrow our survey effort. And finally, I would say that a hybrid approach is probably what is going to work well. We should be using multiple models. We should be using species distribution models to localize where we focus. We should use movement models to predict areas we should survey. We should collect all the data that we can get in terms of this opportunistic data, both to help validate that, but also to find further predictors in terms of that habitat measure. I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have time for questions on my question.
And do you ever consider that we're getting additional data from the sites usually reports came in and some are validated.
So we have, for us in New York, we have records from our heritage program. There was for a while a database where people could call in or send in records of landing turtles. We also did a little bit of public outreach and said, if you see something, say something, and we got records from that. So we used every source that we can find. For other species that we've been working with, like wood turtles, it's harder to find that kind of data, but you can get enough data across, for example, the New England states to maybe begin to start doing some modeling that might be informative.
We have time for another question.
Right, so in areas where there were high occurrences, those hotspots, were you able to did people send in pictures or anything to see if they're the same specimens like one? Is that like affect how many shows people are like?
Well, so we mark every live animal that we find. So if it's a second time or a third time crossing the road detection, if it's us, we'll be able to tell that. Not from the citizen science data, but again, it's so sparse that probably most of the records are unique records.